democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guests are Rafif Jouejati, activist and member of the Syrian opposition, speaking to us from Washington, D.C., and Patrick Seale, leading British writer on the Middle East, wrote a biography of Bashar al-Assad's father called Assad, The Struggle for the Middle East, and most recently, The Struggle for Arab Independence, Riyad al-Sol and the makers of the modern Middle East. We just heard a clip of the State Department spokesperson, Victoria Nuland, blaming Iran. Can you respond, Patrick Seale?
Well, the point about that massacre at Hula, the real responsibility has not been established. Ms. Nuland and others have immediately blamed the regime's notorious Shabiha thugs. But a very serious German newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the leading West German newspaper, has recently published a report quoting its sources on the ground, saying this is not the case, that the massacre was conducted by anti-Assad Sunni militias who then filmed their victims and posted videos on the internet blaming the regime. Now, this clearly demands an investigation, internal investigation, to establish what the truth is. The fact is that both sides have committed atrocious crimes. Ms. Jouejati is quite right in saying that the population, or part of it, has serious grievances against the Assad regime over the years. Police brutality, favoritism for certain communities, lack of freedom, neglect after the great drought of recent years in Syria, and many other things. Of course they have grievances, but the problem now is no longer a purely local one. It's become a regional one. The Syrian crisis cannot be separated from the tremendous pressures being put on Iran. The United States seems to have adopted Israel's position to attempt to bring down both regimes, the regime in Tehran and the regime in Damascus. Now, you may have noticed that President Shimon Peres of Israel, Deputy Prime Minister Shaul Mofaz, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself have all in recent days called for the overthrow of the Syrian regime. I mean, Netanyahu wants to bring down the whole Tehran, Damascus, Hezbollah resistance axis, which has dented Israel's supremacy in recent years. So this has become a regional conflict. Now, some Arab states, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, also seem to see the crisis in sectarian terms. They think that Iran, a Shia power, could challenge Sunni primacy in the region. But you saw your program began at around a few minutes ago with the massacres in Iraq of Shia civilians. Now, who do you think triggered that sectarian conflict? It was the United States with its invasion of Iraq in 2002, which led to the collapse of the state, to a sectarian civil war in which hundreds of thousands of people were killed and millions displaced. Do they want the same thing to happen in Syria? Hasn't Syria suffered enough? Shouldn't the West and Russia join in imposing a ceasefire on both sides instead of fueling the flames? The United States is said to be coordinating the flow of money, intelligence, and weapons to the rebels, and then complaining that Russia is doing the same.
I want to ask, let me just ask Rafif Jouejati to respond both on Victoria Nuland's comments about Iran's involvement and who should be held responsible or who is responsible for the Hula massacre.
Absolutely. Let's start with the Hula massacre. There are satellite images of regime tank positions stationed all around the area. Logically, by any reasonable calculation, only the regime would have had access to that area in such numbers. There was intense shelling on the area just before the Shabiha went in. They didn't just shoot children. They practically beheaded them. Children were stabbed repeatedly. In many other instances of Shabiha violence, they have actually set fire to their victims. So that's on the Hula massacre. The regime bears full responsibility. And when Bashar al-Assad delivered a speech just days after it, he said that not even monsters could have carried out this attack. And I believe by not even monsters, he was speaking about his own shabiha. With regard to the German article, Mr. Seale, I did read it. The reporter did not cite any credible sources. What we have gotten from Hole residents, those who remain, were eyewitness accounts of what has happened. So I would discredit that article 100%. In terms of Iran, Iran has, since the very beginning, been supporting the Assad regime through infusions of cash when the sanctions began to take effect in Syria. They have provided military equipment. They have provided surveillance technology. It is the very surveillance technology that enabled the Assad regime to blow up the house where Marie Colvin was when she was killed, the journalist who was killed as she was uploading information. Iran has been recently bragging about its support for the Assad regime. I don't think we want to go too far and muddy the waters by talking about what Israel's ambitions may be. What we're talking about is a popular revolution that the regime is trying to repress through massive military force.
I want to ask more about Saudi Arabia and Qatar's role in the conflict. The Independent of London reported today Syrian rebel groups had received multiple shipments of arms, including Kalashnikov assault rifles, machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank weaponry. The weapons were paid for by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and smuggled through Turkey. Patrick Seale, the significance of who's on what side here, and Russia sending helicopters to Bashar al-Assad.
This is the trouble. I mean, there's so much foreign intervention with each of the external actors pursuing its own strategic goals. Now, the opposition, the rebels, know, I believe, that they cannot hope to defeat the Syrian army on their own. Their whole strategy has been to try and trigger a Western military intervention. Now, that's been slow in coming. Now, to trigger such an intervention, they have either perpetrated massacres themselves, and I stick with the report from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, or they try and provoke the regime into massacres. Now, what that German newspaper said was that rebels attacked some checkpoints manned by the army. And in the firefight that followed, which lasted about 90 minutes, the massacre took place. And they contacted many sources on the ground, which Mrs. Jouejati dismisses, and said they reported that the killing was done by anti-Assad Sunni militants. Now, I'm not saying one thing or the other. I'm saying that this should be investigated. Now, Mrs. Jouejati is, I think, mistaken in not seeing the wider context of this tragic Syrian struggle. And the only way to resolve it is not by force of arms. The only way to resolve it is by diplomacy. That is why it was a great mistake to sabotage Kofi Annan's mission, as I'm afraid the United States is doing. It pays lip service to his peace mission while conniving in the arming of the opposition. The West and the Russians should combine in imposing a ceasefire on both sides and bringing both sides to the table. That is the only way to save what is left of Syria.
Rafif Jouejati, can you respond to that? Would you agree with Patrick Seale's assessment that what the rebels are trying to do is trigger military intervention?
Absolutely not. I think the calls for military intervention came at a time when the civilian population was being so heavily shelled that they had nobody to turn to, and the last resort was to call for foreign intervention. I would maintain the revolution began peacefully, and it would have stayed peaceful had the Assad regime not started firing on protesters, firing on mourners attending the funerals of protesters who'd been killed the day before, kidnapping, detaining, torturing children. Let's remember Hamza Ali al-Khatib, who was 13 years old, who was detained, tortured, mutilated, and returned to his village as an example. The Free Syrian Army is composed of defected soldiers who did not wish to shoot at unarmed civilians. Let's go back to the roots of the revolution and see how it has progressed from March 2011. Let's also take a look at the weapons that Russia is shipping to Syria. Let's talk about foreign intervention and the intervention that Assad has allowed to enter the country in the form of Russian and Iranian support.
So what do you want to see happen now, Rafif?
I would love to see the Annan peace plan take effect. I would love to see the Assad regime respect a single tenet of that 6-point plan, starting with a full pullback of military equipment and troops, and perhaps ending with independent media and foreign journalists allowed to enter to investigate and report on what is actually happening.
Rafif, can you explain why the former head of the Syrian National Council, Burhan Ghaliun, was forced to resign last month? And tell us a little bit about the new head, Abdul Basit Saida. Did Ghaliun's resignation have something to do with calls for intervention?
I really can't speak for the Syrian National Council. My speculation is that Burhan Ghaliun had originally been seen as a consensus builder and was having a challenge in actually building consensus. Now, we have to remember that the Syrian National Council, A, is a relatively new organization, and B, populated by people who have been politically and intellectually repressed for more than 5 decades. So there are some growing pains. There is some dysfunction, certainly. I don't think anybody would dispute that. With Burhan Ghaliun stepping down, and it was voluntarily, by the way, he offered to resign as soon as a suitable replacement was found. The council decided it had found a suitable replacement, and he was elected. Now, Mr. Abdul Basit appears to be a consensus builder, appears to enjoy popularity with the very important Kurdish minority, and we hope that under his leadership, the Syrian National Council can reorganize and overcome some of the difficulties it was facing in the past.
Your response, finally, Patrick Seale.
Well, Mr. Jouejati doesn't seem to be in close touch with the Syrian National Council or the opposition. Its official policy is to call for a foreign intervention. It knows it can't do the job by itself. That's why these rebels are trying desperately to provoke the regime into massacres. Now, the regime's strategy is the very contrary. It will not tolerate pockets of armed rebels on its territory, so it's going all out to exterminate them. So the more the rebels are armed, the more bloodshed there will be, and the great need is to support Kofi Annan in every possible way, to encourage the holding of a big international conference in Moscow, perhaps, with both sides represented. Stop the bloodshed and start talking. That's what the international community should insist upon.
Amy, well, I'd like to respond to that, if I may.
Very quickly, and we're wrapping up right now.
Very quickly. I will tell Mr. Seale that while I am in Washington, D.C., I am in daily contact with activists on the ground in Syria. I represent the largest network of activists on the ground in Syria. And the Syrian National Council called for military intervention in response to the people who were being shelled by regime forces, not to further any ulterior motives, but to respond to what the people were asking for.
We're going to leave it there. Rafif Jouejati, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Activist and member of the Syrian opposition, Patrick Seale, leading British writer on the Middle East. He's speaking to us from the south of France, she from Washington, D.C. His latest book is The Struggle for Arab Independence. This is Democracy Now!